April 18th, 1942, 0320 hours. North Pacific. The flight deck of USS Hornet, pitching like a living thing beneath dark, heaving seas. A lookout's report hisses over the ship-to-ship line. Surface contact. Bearing 093 course. Range 12,000 yards. Lieutenant Commander Frank Akers drops his binoculars, jaw set, and reaches for the intercom. A small Japanese picket vessel, Nido Maru, has stumbled into the path of an American task force carrying 16 B-25 Mitchells lashed down on a wooden deck never meant for Army bombers. No one on that bridge can see far beyond the sheets of rain, but everyone feels the moment harden. A chance sighting has snapped shut the clockwork of fate. Whatever this mission was going to be, risky, improbable, audacious, it just became now or never. The weather is a bully. Mountains of water batter the bow. Wind blasts to nearly 40 knots. Visibility shrinks to a smear under 5 miles. These are not the training horizons Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle learned by heart at Eglin Field. The intended launch point sits 650 nautical miles from Japan, a brutal 250 miles beyond the plan. The arithmetic is ugly. Each B-25 carries about 141 gallons of gas. If the crews nurse their throttles with the patience of monks and the ocean behaves, they might make the Chinese coast. Might. The idea that carried them here was born out of humiliation and clarity. December 7th, 1941 had taught Americans a cold fact. Oceans don't keep danger out anymore. Japanese carrier pilots had turned Hawaii into a graveyard without warning. If that is true in one direction, it can be true in the other. Hit the Japanese home islands. Make the Emperor's subjects look up and realize their sky is not a shield. Punch a hole straight through the myth of forever safety. President Franklin Roosevelt didn't want a plan for someday. He wanted a blow that landed while bodies and oil still swirled together in Pearl Harbor's black water. While Japanese banners advanced across the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, the nation needed proof, visible, undeniable, that it could hit back. Admiral Ernest J. King understood the strategic geometry. Japan's shell of bases, from the Kurils down toward the Dutch East Indies, was thick with guns, airstrips, and patrols. Punching through it island by island would take years. But behind that wall lived the target that mattered most, the homeland, guarded not just by fighters and reconnaissance lines, but by an assumption repeated so often it felt like law. No American bomber could reach Tokyo from any airfield we possessed. Then, a quirk of observation unlatched a new possibility. On January 10th, 1942, Captain Francis Lowe watched Army bombers practicing short takeoffs at Naval Station Norfolk, using a runway painted with a carrier outline. 2 engine bombers from a carrier? Every handbook said that was nonsense. But the image stuck inside Lowe's mind like a nail. What if the Navy could carry the Army to within range? What if the impossible was just a matter of nerve, weight, and wind over deck? USS Hornet, 19,800 tons standard, about 25,500 tons stuffed to the rails, was a sleek predator built for fighters and dive bombers. 809 feet of flight deck, 86 feet across at her narrowest, 4 turbines pushing 120,000 shaft horsepower, 32.5 knots when she ran. Captain Mark Mitcher commanded nearly 3,000 souls. For this mission, he gave up his air group. The deck belonged to the Army now. 16 squat-shouldered B-25B Mitchells, looking far too big and far too stubborn to fly from a ship. Their leader was a compact man with a skyscraper's reputation. Jimmy Doolittle, MIT doctorate in aeronautics, trophies with names that sounded like racing horses. The first to loop outside, to cross the continent in less than a day, to lift off and land by instruments alone. 45 years old and still restless, he'd spent more hours wrestling with the edge of what airplanes could do than most pilots spent in the air, period. The B-25 didn't come aboard as a standard model. On paper, wingspan 67 feet 7, length about 53.5, empty weight just north of 21,000 pounds. Twin-right Cyclone engines, 1,700 horsepower each. A typical range around 350 miles with a 3,000-pound bomb load. On this operation, typical had been stripped for parts. The lower turret, dead weight and drag came off, saving roughly 600 pounds and smoothing the airflow. Fuel tanks multiplied like extra ribs in the bomb bay, along the crawlway, where the turret had been. Capacity jumped from 646 to that precious 1,241 gallons. The top-secret Norden bomb site stayed ashore. In its place, Captain Charles Ross Greening's handmade contraption cost pocket change and did the job well enough at low altitude. Every gallon saved, every pound shaved, turned minutes of flight into miles of hope. Numbers governed the gamble. Carriers like Hornet needed at least 500 feet for a bomber-sized takeoff. These Mitchells could count on 467 feet from start to the bow's biting edge. They would need more than 40 knots of wind racing down the deck to lift that much weight before the ocean walloped them. Each plane tipped the scales at around 31,000 pounds when fueled and loaded, nearly double the heft of the Navy's largest carrier-borne aircraft. No Army bomber had ever left a carrier in combat. No medium bomber had ever flown 2,400 miles over open water without escort. The plan depended on pilots hitting every note of a new song on a stormy stage the first time it was performed. Japan's defensive idea in April 1942 looked airtight on paper. The combined fleet patrolled widely, bolstered by land-based airfields strung along conquered islands. Submarines screened approaches, but the first and simplest tripwire lay just off the coast. Picket boats, many of them converted fishing craft, sitting 50 miles apart in a line that stretched hundreds of miles into the Pacific. Each boat had a radio. Spot the enemy and shout before you die. One of those boats, Nidomaru, about 70 tons with a crew of 11 and a single machine gun, had just done her job. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same stone-faced commander who'd led the strike on Pearl Harbor, believed American carriers couldn't come within 600 miles of Japan without getting noticed by those pickets. The closest heavy bomber bases America could use were too far. Alaska's Aleutians sat more than 2,000 miles away. Australia was nearly 3,000. Fuel and bomb weight don't bend. The numbers said it couldn't be done, but numbers also don't see through rain. At 0310 hours on April 18th, radar aboard USS Enterprise, Hornet's armored partner, picked up a surface contact, bearing U-28 Dao, 21,000 yards out, moving southwest at 9 knots across Task Force 16's path. Admiral William Bull Halsey faced a split-second fork: hold course and risk an alarm tripping inland, or launch now at a range that the plan called unacceptable. In a few hours, the Nidomaru would get close enough to confirm what she'd guessed. By RO 5:30, she had. Seaman First Class Nakamura sent Tokyo a garbled but chilling report. 3 enemy carriers, 650 nautical miles east of Inubasaki, steering west at 20 knots. The words weren't elegant, but they were enough. Nashville's 6-inch guns found the picket almost immediately, Star F-38, and tore the small ship open. She burned and went under, but her radio had done its work. Halsey looked left, looked right, then snapped the only choice left to him: launch or give up. At 0620, his signal shot to Hornet: launch planes. A second message rode the same path, pointed like a prayer at a compact pilot in the lead bomber. To Colonel Doolittle and his gallant command: good luck and God bless you. Doolittle's B-25, tail 40-2344, weighted 467 feet from a cold green end. Lieutenant Henry Miller, the Navy launch officer, watched the 30-foot swells heave the bow up and down and chose his moment. He spun a checkered flag. Jimmy shoved the throttles forward. Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard monitored the engines as cylinder heads edged toward the line that says, "No more." Beside Doolittle, co-pilot Richard Cole called out the airspeed rising, 40, 50, 60 knots, while the horizon pitched. The deck's white edge screamed toward them. At 0820, with less than 50 feet remaining, Doolittle eased the yoke back. The bomber leapt, sagged toward the froth as the deck wind vanished, kissed spray, then clawed into the gray morning. 1 airplane airborne, 15 to go. They rose in 4-minute beats. Travis Hoover skimmed away with 10 feet to spare. Robert Gray dropped so low, his tail gunner tasted salt from the wake. David Jones watched a curtain of green water slap his windscreen before the Mitchell staggered upward. Miracles repeated themselves in rhythm. Each crew fought the same enemy, the weight, the wind, the wall of fear, and won. The plan called for radio silence and altitude so low a gull might complain. The 16 little ships of aluminum and will skimmed toward Japan, keeping their voices to themselves and their eyes on compasses, drift meters, and dead reckoning. No beacons, no friendly fighters. The Pacific behind them, an enemy coastline ahead, and between those two, just skill and luck. Doolittle's crew hit the coast around 12:30 local time. In the back, navigator Henry Potter had done the old-fashioned math, trimming error to a handful of miles despite squalls and wind shifts. Fishing boats passed below. Some people waved, fooled by the fake twin tail guns they'd bolted on to mimic a heavier weapon, and by the altitude that made the bombers look like homegrown patrol craft. Earlier that morning, Tokyo's alert system had squawked awake because of the Nidomaru report. By noon, they'd stood it down. Saturday had returned to shopping, cooking, school, paperwork. And then, at 13:15, Staff Sergeant Fred Bramer opened the bomb bay doors of 40 into 2344 over the Chiyoda area. 4 500-pound incendiary clusters fell from 1,200 feet and stitched fire across 10 city blocks. 30 seconds later, Hoover smashed the Tokyo Special Steelworks. An orange column blew skyward like a torch. Gray took a bite out of Tokyo Gas and Electric. Everett Holstrom hammered Agura oil. David Jones laced warehouses in Yokohama. Aim points shifted to avoid clouds and flak. Crews made decisions in seconds, with maps rattling on their knees and tracers rising like angry bees. The second wave arrived between 1,300 and about 1,400 hours. Dean Hallmark, the Green Hornet, pressed through ugly anti-aircraft bursts to hit Yokohama's steel mills. Ted Lawson ran bombs across Nippon machinery. Harold Watson churned the Tokyo Naval Arsenal. Richard Joyce beat on Japan's special steel. Assessing damage was fantasy. Staying alive was work enough. They ran for China at maximum speed, fuel needles sinking faster than the plan liked. One crew fought a different problem. Captain Edward York's left engine drank fuel like a broken pipe, doubling its use. China lay too far. York turned the nose northwest toward the Soviet Far East and landed in Vladivostok after 6 hours. Moscow, balancing war and diplomacy, quietly interned the crew for 14 months, calling them absent in public while treating them hospitably behind walls. Over Nagoya, William Farrow's crew met rising fighters. 9 A6M0s clawed for position, but low altitude and quick hands made the intercept clumsy. Bombardier Corporal Jacob de Shazer toggled incendiaries over the Mitsubishi aircraft plant, torching the paint shop and scarring the assembly halls. One city after another felt the same small but shocking sting. Air raid sirens, not heard since the 1923 earthquake, wailing above a capital that believed it could not be touched. The raid's true weight was never the rubble. It was the shiver that ran through a nation taught to believe oceans were walls, and the emperor's home was beyond reach. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo was inspecting a base when one B-25 roared so close he could see the pilot's head turning in the cockpit. The bomber didn't fire a shot at him. It didn't need to. The shock had landed. Turning west, the crews confronted the bill finally arriving due. Headwinds above 25 knots bled their tanks dry. The Chinese airfield at Chuchao, briefed as a beacon with flares and lights, stayed dark and silent. Radios begged for help. Silence answered. The choices narrowed to 2. Jump into black unknown, or try to put heavy metal down on water in darkness. Lawson attempted a controlled ditch at around 110 Metif. The ocean broke the bomber in half. Lawson blew through the windscreen, battering his face and shattering his leg. Navigator Charles McClure, bleeding and stunned, found him and dragged him free. Gunner David Thatcher kept diving back into the wreck to yank out what he could: gear, morphine, hope. Because secrecy had been ruthless, Chinese units were not fully warned. Some anti-aircraft batteries, thinking the dark shapes were Japanese, fired. Donald Smith's crew took hits near Nanchang and bailed out over occupied territory. Weather thickened, clouds dropping to 500 feet, visibility flattening to near nothing. Mountains rose to 6,000 where maps faded. By 2,200 to 2,400 hours, gauges kissed empty. Harold Watson ordered his men out at 11,000 feet when both engines coughed dry. The 5 parachuted into Jiangxi's cold, mountainous quilt, landing miles apart. Watson dangled 30 feet up, tangled in a tree for 6 miserable hours until farmers heard his calls and cut him down. Hallmark's Green Hornet fought it as long as physics allowed. After hammering Yokohama, he ran west into night. Navigator Chase Nielsen believed they had crossed the coast, but no airfield appeared. Both engines were running on fumes. At 23:45, Hallmark gave the words every crew dreads: brace for a crash landing. The impact smashed him into the panel and knocked his co-pilot, Robert Metter, senseless. William Dieter and Donald Fitzmaurice drowned when the fuselage filled. Nielsen forced himself to the surface, dragged his wounded crew to the beach, and counted heads that would never answer. Pharaoh's crew, after Nagoya, jumped at 8,000 feet into a pit where even the ground seemed to move. DeShazer thumped into a rice paddy used as fertilizer. He rose covered in human waste, disoriented, unable to speak the language, and stumbled straight into a Japanese patrol. He would spend 40 months in solitary, tortured for answers he did not have. Where had the carriers been hiding? Pharaoh and navigator George Barr were taken not long after. Engineer Harold Spatz was beaten ragged in a temple where he tried to hide. Co-pilot Robert Height sought help from villagers who'd been warned they would die if they aided Americans. He was captured too. Tokyo's response was cold and fast. The emperor ordered that captured flyers be treated as war criminals. Because the raiders had flown in flight suits rather than formal uniforms, lawyers could call them spies. 8 men faced a show trial in Shanghai. On October 15, 1942, Pharaoh, Hallmark, and Spatz were tied to small crosses at Public Cemetery No. 1 and shot. Their bodies were cremated, an added humiliation. Robert Mader, shattered by disease and hunger, died in captivity on December 1, 1943. Barr, Height, Nielsen, and DeShazer endured starvation, isolation, and beatings for 3.5 years, and somehow lived to see August 1945. Out of 80 raiders, 69 reached safety in free China. 3 died in crashes or drownings. 8 were captured by the Japanese. 1 crew rode out a year of Soviet internment. None of the airplanes returned. All 16 B-25s were lost, ditched, crashed, or abandoned. In Japan, the physical damage was limited. Around 50 dead, 252 wounded, 112 structures destroyed or damaged. Looking at nothing but the scorecard, Doolittle believed he'd failed. Standing in a soaked Chinese field beside a broken airplane, he told his men he expected a court-martial for losing every plane. Staff Sergeant Paul Leonard stared back and said the opposite out loud. "You just earned the Medal of Honor." Japan's high command felt something heavier than bomb splinters. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, listened to the first reports during breakfast. He went silent for half an hour, then gave the orders that would pull his Navy into a trap at Midway. The operation, once a debated priority, was greenlit and accelerated. The goal, find and crush the carriers that had humiliated the Empire. Roosevelt announced the raid with a magician's wink. Where did those bombers launch from? Shangri-La, he said, borrowing the name of a mythical Himalayan refuge. Americans, starving for good news, devoured it. War bond sales spiked more than 20% that week. Even more important, Japan pulled home 4 fighter groups from the Southwest Pacific to protect the homeland. Those squadrons' absence starved the battles over New Guinea and the Solomons, tilting the scales at Coral Sea and Guadalcanal. The Navy also hurried Midway by about 6 weeks, trading preparation for speed. That choice mattered. China bore a terrible cost. The Japanese Army unleashed Operation Seigo across areas where the raiders had fallen, Jiangsu and Jiangxi, sending roughly 100,000 troops with orders to punish anyone who had helped. Villages burned. Wells were fouled with cholera and typhoid. The death toll, men, women, children, rose toward 250,000 in 3 months of systematic reprisal. The raid lit beacons of hope abroad and bonfires of grief in China. Tactically, the mission rewired American thinking about how to hit hardened targets. Low-level runs that day pointed towards skip-bombing techniques that would butcher Japanese shipping later in the war. The B-25 became a shapeshifter. Engineers pushed out new models like the G and H, fitting a 75mm cannon in the nose, turning the medium bomber into a kind of airborne gunboat that could chew up barges and airfields with brutal close-range fire. Midway arrived on June 4, 1942. Yamamoto brought 4 carriers, confident that crushing weight would finally erase the American nuisance from the map. U.S. codebreakers had already peeled back enough of his plans to set a counter-ambush. Within minutes of decisive contact, dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown cracked open Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Hiryu died later in the day. The ocean swallowed 4 carriers and a generation of elite aviators. Metal can be replaced with time. Training a veteran takes years Americans suddenly had, and Japan suddenly did not. The balance of carrier power tilted and never came back. Follow the line back from that turning point, and it runs through a wet, pitching deck on a gray April morning. For what he did that day, and what it changed, Doolittle stood in the White House on May 19, 1942, and received the Medal of Honor from Roosevelt. He skipped a rank straight to Brigadier General, then went on to command the 12th Air Force in North Africa, the 15th in the Mediterranean, and finally the mighty 8th in England. Every raider wore the Distinguished Flying Cross. China honored them with the Order of the Cloud and Banner. The human echoes kept rolling. Ted Lawson wrote 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, a book that turned into a film seen by millions. Jacob DeShazer, who had spent 40 months inside a cell, went back to Japan after the war, carrying a Bible and an unthinkable choice to forgive. He even helped lead one of his former guards to Christianity. Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot on that first takeoff, lived to 103 and died in 2019. The last of the men who had proved the impossible was just very, very hard. Back in the engineering world, what had been improvisation turned into doctrine. Carriers evolved from fleet umbrellas to global hammers, tools not just for defending battleships, but for reaching deep and hitting hard. The marriage of Army air crews and Navy decks in 1942, so strange that it felt like heresy, became the seed of joint operations that are standard practice today. Special operations learned a lesson planted by 16 Mitchells. Range can be stretched, support can be minimal, courage can substitute for mass, and creativity can patch the distance in between. Japanese historians later pointed to that April strike as the psychological pivot of the Pacific War, not Pearl Harbor, which had inflated confidence, not Midway, which rewrote the order of battle. The pivot was the instant American bombers appeared over Tokyo, revealing that 1,000 years of water meant nothing once carriers learned to fling iron across horizons. The executions haunted Japan's military leadership long after the war. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, barely able to stand, walked to his death with a steadiness that shamed his captors. At 4:30 p.m. on October 15, 1942, at Public Cemetery No. 1, outside Shanghai, Hallmark, Farrow, and Spatz were tied, blindfolded, given a private second to pray, and shot. Their bodies were burned. Later, Robert Mader died alone in a cell on December 1, 1943. Malnutrition and dysentery, finishing what brutality began. Barr, Haidt, Nielsen, and DeShazer survived because they chose every day to stay alive for one another. When you list the mission's numbers in a row, they still don't quite look real. 16 bombers, 31,000 pounds each, rolling off a deck in 40-knot winds and 30-foot seas. A 650-mile sprint to cities they had only studied on paper. 64,000 pounds of ordnance dropped in daylight across 5 targets. Then another 1,500 miles in the dark over mountains with empty tanks, praying for light that never showed. Hornet herself would last just 6 more months, going down at Santa Cruz on October 26, 1942, with 111 sailors and 140 aircraft. But her legend was already written. The Doolittle raid was more than an operation. It was an argument answered with action. That imagination could change the math of war, that audacity could sandbag a lack of mass, that a small number of Americans could rewire the world's largest battlefield. Japan learned that home was touchable. America learned it could win. Those 2 realizations bent the rest of the Pacific campaign toward Tokyo Bay and surrender. Decades later, deep inside the National Museum of the United States Air Force, you can find a twisted scrap of aluminum stamped 40s to 20 Sutsky 7. all that remained of Lieutenant Edgar McElroy's B-25, recovered from a Chinese mountainside in 1962. The metal is pitted and scarred. Under a microscope, dust from Tokyo's factories still clings to the grain. The artifact tells a simple story, in a language the war understands. Evidence that heavy bombers once rose from a carrier deck, flew across an ocean, and changed the course of things bigger than themselves. The final measure of what happened came from a place no one expected. In 1959, Prince Nobuhito Takamatsu, Emperor Hirohito's brother, attended a reunion of Doolittle's men in Tucson. Why had he come? He answered without poetry and made poetry anyway. 16 American planes changed our world. The bombs were small. The idea they delivered was enormous. Courage and innovation smashed tradition and certainty. Every modern jet that claws from a carrier deck, every mission where services meld into one body, inherits something from April 18th, 1942. The raid did not win the Pacific War. It proved the Pacific War could be won. And that is what those 16 B-25s carried on their backs as they roared toward the end of a wooden deck into a gray, angry morning. More than gasoline and bombs. They carried a nation's will, bloodied but unbroken. They carried a message that distance and water would no longer shelter anyone who sought to make war. They carried blueprints for how to fight in the century ahead. More than anything, they carried a truth that soldiers and sailors still use when the odds sneer. The impossible is merely difficult, and the difficult, on the right Tuesday, with the right crew, can be done.